On April 21, 2026, day 80 of the search for Nancy Guthrie, the man leading that search sent 22 pages to the Board of Supervisors of Pima County, Arizona. The board had been waiting for those pages since April 7th. They had invoked a law that predates Arizona statehood to demand them. They had voted unanimously, 5-0, to compel the sheriff of Pima County to answer 4 specific questions about his record, under oath, on the record, with the legal weight of sworn testimony behind every word. What arrived at 2 p.m. on April 21st while the board was in session was not under oath. It was a letter, written by an attorney, carefully hedged, legally constructed to protect its client rather than to provide the transparency the board had demanded. And the man it was written on behalf of, Sheriff Chris Nanos, the person responsible for leading the most watched missing persons investigation in modern American history, did not attend the meeting at which it was received. He sent his lawyer instead. This is Forensic Disconnect, and today we are going to do what the mainstream coverage of this letter has not done. We are going to go through it completely. Every claim, every explanation, every omission. Every sentence that does specific legal work rather than specific evidentiary work, and we are going to hold it against the documented record, the internal affairs files, the deposition transcript, the Arizona Republic investigation, the statements from supervisors and deputies and law enforcement colleagues, and let the comparison speak for itself. Because the letter is a document about a sheriff. But it is also a document about the investigation into the disappearance of an 84-year-old woman. And understanding what the letter reveals about the person running that investigation is essential to understanding what this case has been and what it still needs to become. Before we go further, subscribe and hit the notification bell. We are here every single day covering this case with the depth and specificity that the daily news cycle does not have time for. Day 81. Subscribe so you are here for every day that follows. Let's start with the context. Because to understand why this letter matters, you need to understand the full sequence of events that produced it, not just the last 2 weeks, but the entire arc of what has been building around Chris Nanos since this investigation began. On February 1st, 2026, Nancy Guthrie was taken from her home in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood of Tucson, Arizona. Blood was found on her front step. Her medication was on the counter. Her pacemaker went silent at 2:28 in the morning. And the investigation that was supposed to find her began. In the first hours of that investigation, the crime scene that should have been meticulously preserved was, by the account of former Pima County Sheriff Richard Carmona, corrupted. A pizza delivery vehicle was allowed to drive across the front lawn during active evidence collection. The lead detective assigned to the case had never worked a homicide, and the framework applied to what the blood, the disabled camera, the propped open back doors, and the absent medication should have immediately identified as a criminal abduction was, for the critical first hours, a search and rescue framework. The framework you apply when someone may have wandered away, not when someone has been taken by force. 33 days passed before a task force was assembled. 33 days of an investigation conducted without the coordinated multi-agency, specialized structure that a kidnapping of this nature required from the first morning. 33 days during which evidence degraded, witnesses' memories faded, and the distance between the perpetrators and the investigators grew. During those 33 days and in the weeks that followed, Nanos held press conferences. He made statements about the investigation. He described leads and evidence in terms that former Orange County prosecutor Matt Murphy said constituted prosecutorial decisions that exceeded his legal authority as a sheriff. He said on national television that specific individuals had been eliminated as suspects, clearances that Murphy said no sheriff has the authority to make publicly, and that any competent defense attorney would use in court to complicate a prosecution. He said he had no regrets about how the investigation had been handled. He said, asked whether the search had gone the way he wanted it to go, yes, absolutely. And then, in March, the Arizona Republic published a story that changed the accountability dynamic of this investigation entirely. The Republic had obtained documents through public records requests, employment records, internal affairs files. The specific, detailed, dated documentation of what happened during Chris Nanos' 6 years with the El Paso Police Department from 1976 to 1982. What those documents showed was not what his public resume had described. His resume, as it appeared on the Pima County Sheriff's Department's official website until after the Republic story was published, said he had worked with the El Paso Police Department until 1984. The record showed he left in 1982. The resume said he had been promoted to the rank of detective in El Paso. The records did not support this, and the circumstances under which he left, not a retirement, not a transfer to another agency, not a voluntary departure, were documented in the internal affairs files with a specificity that left no room for interpretation. On July 21, 1982, Chris Nanos submitted a resignation in lieu of termination from the El Paso Police Department. The official language of that phrase means, "Leave now or be fired." It is the mechanism a law enforcement agency uses when an officer's conduct has made continued employment untenable, but the agency is willing to allow the departure to be characterized as voluntary. It is not a neutral administrative category. It is a last resort for people who would otherwise be terminated. And it came at the end of 6 years that the internal affairs records describe in specific and documented detail. Between 1977 and 1982, Chris Nanos was the subject of 8 disciplinary actions at the El Paso Police Department. 8. The suspensions alone cost him 37 days of work, days suspended without pay, days on administrative leave as a consequence of conduct that his own department found serious enough to warrant formal sanction. The specific incidents are in the record. Not allegations, not rumors, not the claims of political opponents. Internal affairs files from the El Paso Police Department, obtained through public records requests and published by the Arizona Republic. July 3, 1979, a shot-fired incident, 1 day suspended. July 9, 1979, off-duty conduct, gambling. Specifically, he was caught gambling on a pool game by undercover law enforcement officers who were there specifically because the game was illegal. 1 day suspended. May 27, 1980, failure to assist. 10 days suspended. March 1, 1982, insubordination. 1 day suspended. March 2, 1982, inefficiency. 3 days suspended. June 4, 1982, habitual tardiness, 2 days suspended, and then the most serious entry, the one that resulted in 15 days of suspension, the single longest disciplinary consequence in the 6-year record, the one that Supervisor Matt Hines described in the most specific terms. In 1982, Chris Nanos was suspended for 15 days for excessive force. The specific allegation, as described in the internal affairs documentation and reported by Hines, was that Nanos struck a handcuffed suspect in the head with a flashlight. The man was hospitalized. He was admitted to the intensive care unit. A handcuffed suspect, struck with a flashlight. ICU. 15 days suspended. Not terminated. Not prosecuted. 15 days. And then, on July 21st of that same year, after 6 years and 8 disciplinary actions and 37 days of suspension and a pattern of conduct that had accumulated to the point where the department imposed a 3-day suspension for insubordination and inefficiency, Nanos submitted his resignation rather than accept further discipline. The police chief accepted the offer, and Chris Nanos left the El Paso Police Department. He moved to Arizona. He worked briefly in sales. He worked as a security guard. He applied to the Pima County Sheriff's Department as a corrections officer in 1984. And on that application, he accurately listed his dates of employment with the El Paso Police Department as 1976 to 1982. The dates were correct. But somewhere between that 1984 application and the resume that appeared on the Pima County Sheriff's Department's official website in 2026, the dates changed. The resume said 1976 to 1984, 2 extra years. And the rank, the position he held when he left, was described in terms that did not match the documented record. The department's response, when confronted by the Republic, was that the date discrepancies were administrative in nature and were not intended to mislead or misrepresent Sheriff Nanos' work history. They called them clerical errors. They did not address the resignation in lieu of termination. They did not address the 8 suspensions. They addressed the dates and moved on. And one day after the story was published, the dates on the website were corrected. That is the record that the Board of Supervisors was asking about when they invoked the territorial era law on April 7th. That is the record that the 22-page letter was written to address. Now let's go through what the letter actually says. The letter was written by James M. Cool, Nanos' attorney. Cool is a lawyer. His job is to protect his client. Every sentence in the letter was written with that purpose in mind. This is not a criticism of Cool. It is the job he was hired to do, and he did it. But it means that the letter is not a document designed to provide transparency. It is a document designed to limit legal exposure. And reading it with that understanding is essential to evaluating what it actually contains. On the El Paso resignation, Cool wrote that Nanos resigned from the department in the wake of a dispute with a supervisor over the towing of vehicles. His supervisor wanted to impose a 3-day suspension for insubordination. Nanos appealed the recommended discipline to the police chief. The police chief found in favor of the supervisor. And rather than accept the 3-day suspension, Cool wrote, "Sheriff Nanos offered to resign in lieu of discipline. The chief accepted his offer and Sheriff Nanos resigned." A dispute over the towing of vehicles. That is the framing. Not 8 suspensions over 6 years. Not the handcuffed suspect who went to the ICU. Not the illegal gambling. Not the threats to waste a witness. Not the pattern of excessive force and insubordination that had accumulated since 1977. A single dispute, at the end of a 6-year career, over how vehicles were being towed. That is the explanation that 22 pages produced. Now let's examine that explanation against what the records actually show. The 3-day suspension that preceded the resignation was for insubordination and inefficiency. Those are the entries in the internal affairs files dated March 1st and March 2nd, 1982. Insubordination. Inefficiency. 3 days. Nanos appealed to the police chief. The police chief sided with the supervisors. And then, rather than serve the 3 days, Nanos resigned. Cool's framing, a dispute over the towing of vehicles, is a characterization of what the insubordination involved. It may be accurate in the narrow sense that the specific disagreement was about a vehicle towing procedure, but it presents that single procedural dispute as the explanation for a resignation in lieu of termination, while erasing the 6-year context in which that resignation occurred. 6 years, 8 suspensions, 37 days, a handcuffed suspect in the ICU, and at the end of it, a 3-day suspension for arguing about how cars were being towed. The framing is technically defensible, it is not complete, and the Board of Supervisors, reading it against the internal affairs files they already have, will recognize the gap between what the letter says and what the record shows. Now let's go to the deposition question, because this is the most legally consequential part of the entire accountability story. In December 2025, 2 months before Nancy Guthrie disappeared, Nanos gave a sworn deposition in a First Amendment lawsuit brought by Sergeant Aaron Cross, the president of the Pima County Deputies Association. During that deposition, Nanos was asked directly, "Did you ever receive a discipline that rose to the level of a suspension?" He answered, "No." He had been suspended 8 times. The records are in the internal affairs files, the dates are documented, the incidents are described in specific detail. He had been suspended for a shot-fired incident, and for gambling, and for failure to assist, and for insubordination, and for inefficiency, and for habitual tardiness, and for excessive force that put a handcuffed man in the intensive care unit. And when asked under oath whether he had ever been suspended, he said no. Cool's explanation in the letter addresses this directly. He writes that when Nanos answered that question, he did not understand it to be asking about his history with the El Paso Police Department. He understood it to be asking about his history in Arizona, under the Arizona Peace Officers' Bill of Rights, which governs his service with the Pima County Sheriff's Department, where he has not been suspended. The question, Cool argues, was contextually about Arizona law enforcement conduct. And in that context, Nanos answered accurately. The Hollywood Reporter published the actual deposition transcript. The exchange can be read in full. The question was not, "Have you been suspended under the Arizona Peace Officers' Bill of Rights?" The question was, did you ever receive a discipline that rose to the level of a suspension? That question has a plain meaning. A discipline that rose to the level of a suspension, not a discipline under a specific state's statutory framework. A discipline of the type called a suspension at any point in a law enforcement career. The answer, for a person who has been suspended 8 times in 6 years at a previous agency, is yes. The answer Nanos gave was no. Cool writes that Nanos, reviewing the transcript shortly after the deposition, spotted his misunderstanding and promptly notified his attorney. He does not say what his attorney did after receiving that notification. He does not say whether the court was notified. He does not say whether opposing counsel was notified. He does not say whether any attempt was made to correct the sworn record. He says Nanos notified his attorney. Supervisor Matt Hines and the Pima County Board of Supervisors have pushed the Arizona Attorney General to pursue a perjury charge with the Department of Justice. That referral has been made. Whether the Department of Justice pursues it is a separate question. But the referral exists. The deposition transcript exists. The internal affairs records exist. And the explanation in the letter, a contextual misunderstanding of a question with a plain meaning, identified and reported to an attorney who did not correct the record, is the best case that 22 pages of lawyered advocacy could produce. Sergeant Aaron Cross, whose lawsuit produced the deposition, who knows this record as well as anyone, called the letter chock full of lies. He pointed out the central procedural problem directly and without hedging. The board asked for a sworn statement. What they got was a lawyer's letter, not under oath, not subject to the legal consequences that sworn testimony carries. An advocacy document dressed as a compliance document. Cool's letter addressed this implicitly. He wrote that Nanos' disciplinary history is irrelevant to the performance of his official duties. He wrote that the discipline happened more than 40 years ago. He wrote that Nanos has never been suspended during his 4 decades of decorated and faithful service with the Pima County Sheriff's Department. He wrote that the voters of Pima County, armed with information about his career, elected him as sheriff, twice. Let's take these arguments one at a time. Irrelevant to the performance of his official duties. This is the argument that past conduct does not predict present conduct. That a man who beat a handcuffed suspect with a flashlight in 1982 is not the same man who is running an investigation in 2026. That 40 years of service without suspension at the Pima County Sheriff's Department constitutes its own evidence of character and competence that supersedes whatever happened in El Paso. This argument is available. Courts apply versions of it in evidence law. Prior bad acts are not always admissible as proof of current character. The argument has legal standing. But the Board of Supervisors is not a court. They are elected officials evaluating whether the person they are constitutionally responsible for overseeing is fit to hold the office he holds and capable of leading the investigation that has consumed national attention for 81 days. And in that evaluation, the question of whether a man who submitted a resignation in lieu of termination to avoid discipline, then listed incorrect dates on his public resume, then answered no when asked under oath whether he had ever been suspended, is someone whose account of his own record can be trusted. That question is not resolved by calling the history irrelevant. More than 40 years ago. This argument is about time. The events were long ago. The man has changed. 4 decades of service without suspension at the Pima County Sheriff's Department is the relevant record. El Paso is history. But the deposition was not 40 years ago. The deposition was in December 2025, 4 months ago. The question about suspensions was asked of the man who is sheriff today, not the man who was a police officer in Texas in 1982. The answer, no, was given by the current sheriff, under oath, about his complete record as a law enforcement officer. The 40 years of argument addresses the underlying conduct. It does not address the testimony about that conduct. The voters elected him with this information. This argument says that the public scrutiny during the election, which included information about his record, produced an electoral decision to keep him in office. That the democratic process has resolved the accountability question. That re-election is a form of exoneration. Nanos won the 2024 election by 481 votes. A margin thin enough to trigger a recount. And the Arizona Republic's investigation that disclosed the full scope of his El Paso record was published in March 2026, after the election. The voters who elected him in 2024 did not have the internal affairs files, the specific suspension dates, the flashlight incident, the ICU hospitalization, the threat to waste a witness. They had whatever was publicly known before the Republic's investigation. The argument that the voters elected him with this information conflates what was publicly known at election time with what the Republic disclosed afterward. Now let's talk about what the letter does not address, because the omissions in a carefully lawyered document are often as revealing as its contents. The letter does not address the no-regret statement. It does not address the corrupted crime scene. It does not address the 33 days without a task force. It does not address the lead detective who had never worked a homicide. It does not address the public clearances that former prosecutor Murphy said exceeded Nanos' legal authority. It does not address the 11-week delay that kept the hair sample from the FBI laboratory. These are not questions the board asked in their 4 written questions. The board's questions were specifically about employment history, disciplinary actions, immigration cooperation, and budget management. The letter answers those 4 questions in the way that a lawyer's letter answers questions its client does not want to answer directly. But the broader record of how this investigation has been managed is not addressed anywhere in 22 pages. That record exists outside the letter. It exists in the press conferences and the statements and the depositions and the FBI's own public statement that the sheriff sent critical evidence to a private lab instead of complying with the FBI's request. And the board will be reading the letter against that broader record when they meet on May 13th. Now let's move to the forensic picture. Because alongside the accountability story, which is real and important and deserves the attention we are giving it, the science that will actually solve this case is advancing. C.C. Moore speculated this week that the hair sample from Nancy's home is likely at a specific forensic laboratory in San Francisco. Not just any laboratory. The laboratory that provided the DNA evidence that helped convict Rex Heuermann, the Long Island serial killer who pleaded guilty this month to killing 8 women between 1993 and 2010. The evidence that made that conviction possible was retrieved from rootless hair samples. Exactly the same type of evidence that is present in the Nancy Guthrie case. The convergence of these 2 investigations through the same laboratory is not coincidental. The laboratory in question has demonstrated in an active prosecution that concluded with a guilty plea in April 2026 that it can generate a usable genetic profile from rootless hair shaft cells, the exact challenge that the Nancy Guthrie hair sample presents. It has done this work. It has proven this capability. And if Moore's assessment is correct, it is now applying that proven capability to a hair found in the home of a missing 84-year-old woman in Tucson. Former CIA officer and FBI Special Agent Tracy Walder spoke to the significance of the forensic situation this week. She said that in a case where there is a clear lack of video forensic evidence and phone forensic evidence and digital forensic evidence, where the standard investigative tools have not produced the identification that investigators need, the hair becomes not just important, but the thing that everything hinges on, the linchpin, the evidence that, if it works, provides the genetic thread that the entire genealogy process can be built from. C.C. Moore added context about the timeline. Because the Guthrie case is still active, not cold, not archived, not deprioritized, the DNA will be worked on immediately. Not in the queue with cases that have been waiting for years. At the top of the list, with the urgency that a live investigation commands. Moore said, sometimes they can get DNA the first time around, and sometimes they have to go through several attempts before they can get that viable profile. Several attempts. The laboratory's process for rootless hair is not a single pass. It is an iterative effort. Multiple extraction protocols, multiple amplification attempts, multiple analytical approaches until one produces a usable result, or until the sample is exhausted. The fact that the Florida laboratory spent 11 weeks on this sample without producing a result that satisfied the FBI is not evidence that the result is impossible. It is evidence that the Florida laboratory's methods did not succeed. The San Francisco laboratory's methods demonstrated in the Heuermann case, May. Now let's talk about the trial that almost no coverage has mentioned. Because the Nancy Guthrie case is now, for the first time, going to produce a federal criminal trial. and the document that trial generates will become part of the public record of how this crime was committed and how it was investigated. Derrick Callella is 42 years old. He lives in California. On February 4th, 2026, 3 days after Nancy Guthrie was taken, he sent 2 text messages to 2 members of the Guthrie family. The messages asked, "Did you get the Bitcoin? We're waiting on our end for the transaction." Callella is not accused of being the kidnapper. He is not accused of being involved in the planning or execution of Nancy's abduction. He is accused of being an opportunist. He was following the case on television. He found the family's contact information on a website that aggregates personal data. And he sent them a text message pretending to be connected to the real ransom demand, hoping they would pay. He is charged with transmitting a demand for ransom in interstate commerce and with using a telecommunications device without disclosing his identity to abuse, threaten, or harass a person. The grand jury indicted him. His trial is set for June 23rd in the federal courthouse in Tucson. The trial will be public. The testimony will be public. The documents produced by the prosecution, the evidence about how the ransom communication infrastructure of this case worked, what the family received, when they received it, how investigators traced the text messages back to Callella, will become part of the public record of this investigation. Even in a fraud prosecution against an opportunist who had nothing to do with the real crime, the process of proving the fraud will produce documentation about the context in which it occurred. That documentation will be available, and the trial will also be a reminder of something that the investigation has had to navigate since February: the exploitation of a family in crisis by people who see their suffering as an opportunity. Callella is one person, criminally charged, facing trial. But the dynamic he represents, strangers using the visibility of this case for personal gain, whether financial or attentional, has shaped the investigative environment for 81 days. The 30,000 tips that included the actionable alongside the opportunistic. The false bombshells that spread across social media. The YouTubers harassing neighbors. The TMZ correspondent demanding Bitcoin in exchange for information about a location. Callella is going to trial. The others are part of the background noise that the investigation has had to filter every day. Now let's place Day 81 in the complete context of where this investigation stands. The letter is unsworn. The board meets on May 13th to evaluate it. The perjury referral to the Department of Justice is active. The recall campaign needs 122,000 signatures by July 10th. The accountability mechanisms are moving slowly through the institutional processes that constrain their pace. The hair is in the laboratory, probably the San Francisco lab that proved it could read rootless hair in the Heuermann case. The timeline is months. The outcome is not guaranteed. But the capability is demonstrated, and the urgency is real. The blockchain is being traced. The FBI considers it their best lead. The trail is permanent. The FBI has been following it for 81 days. 30,000 leads have been processed. The FBI knows more than the public. It does not yet have the answers that produce an arrest. The trial of Derrick Callella is set for June 23rd. The first criminal proceeding directly connected to this case will produce public testimony and public documents. And Nancy Guthrie is still missing. She is 84 years old, 5 feet tall, silver hair and blue eyes. She was born on January 27, 1942, in Fort Wright, Kentucky. She raised 3 children alone after their father died in Mexico in 1988, when Savannah was 16 years old. She lived in the Tucson area for more than 50 years. She tended flower pots on her back patio, the same flower pots that someone picked up and used to prop open her back doors on the night they took her. She deserves an investigation led by someone whose account of their own record does not require 22 pages of lawyered advocacy to present. She deserves forensic evidence processed by the laboratory best equipped to read it without an 11-week detour through a private contractor. She deserves the blockchain to arrive at a name. She deserves the hair to produce a profile. She deserves the truth. The letter was not under oath. The board meets on May 13th. The laboratory is working. The trail is permanent. Day 81. If you have any information about Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI. That is 1-800-225-5324. Submit tips at tips.fbi.gov. Call the Pima County Sheriff's Department at 520-351-4900. The combined reward from the Guthrie family, the FBI, and 88 Crime is over $1 million. Completely anonymous. One call is all it takes. Hit the like button, subscribe to Forensic Disconnect, drop a comment. Does Nanos' explanation for El Paso hold up for you? Does the towing of vehicles answer explain 8 suspensions and a handcuffed suspect in the ICU? And what do you think happens on May 13th when the board reviews the letter? We read every single comment. Day 81. The letter was not under oath. We will be back tomorrow.